A look at what stories are making the headlines this Friday lunchtime with the latest ITV News.
A year later than planned, Tokyo Olympics 2020 finally kicks off in style. Complete with masks, quarantining and no spectators, it's a Games with a difference. And Team GB takes centre stage with rower Mo Sabihi making history as our first Muslim flag bearer. Also this lunchtime, supermarket factory workers can skip self-isolation, but there's confusion and anger about how plans work with other firms.
It's a stitch-up between the government and the supermarkets, acting rapidly, trying to find a solution to a problem that they've created.
Former England rugby player Martin Offiah will be here to talk about his new passion for saving the planet. And the Marcus Rashford mural represented a nation's stand against racism. Find out why it's now being dismantled.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Charlene White.
Good afternoon. After a year-long wait, Japan has finally kicked off the 2020 Tokyo Olympics in style, with an opening ceremony to mark the start of the Games like no other. Delayed for a year due to the pandemic, of course. There were no spectators in the stadium, only VIPs and world leaders. But the show went on with fireworks and dances and a symbolic show of hope. The athletes wore face masks and were socially distanced. And Team GB have already made history with rower Mo Sabihi becoming the first Muslim to carry the Olympic flag for the team. In a moment, we'll speak to our sports editor Steve Scott in Tokyo. But first, Sangeeta Lal has all the details of the ceremony.
Tokyo 2020 has officially begun. An event steeped in political baggage of a relentless pandemic, scaled back and with no spectators. This year's concept, through the shared pain of the pandemic, although physically separated, the world can come together to create a better normal. Then a performance to a Japanese work song that's been sung for generations, with dancers dressed as carpenters as the Olympics takes shape. The party starts, though, in a stadium behind barricades, and the Olympic flame has ignited anger in many outside. Protests against the Games have continued as COVID cases reach record highs in Japan.
So here we go, and
as the world watches Tokyo, there is no distraction from the scandal already seen this year. The show's director sacked just days before this ceremony. No doubt something organisers hope will fade into the background as the competitions begin.
Look who's here.
Look who's here.
Making history for Team GB, gold medalist rower Mo Sabihi, the first Muslim to carry the British flag at an Olympic opening ceremony. Joined by fellow gold medalist sailor Hannah Mills, representing Britain. As the ceremony continues, messages of hope are shared, that after the world has suffered the pandemic together, it will heal together too. Sangeeta Lal, ITV News.
Well, let's go live to Tokyo now and talk to Steve. I mean, we've been waiting a year for this, haven't we, Steve? And Tokyo really has put on quite a show, haven't they?
Yeah, it has. Very difficult for them to pitch this one right, I think, tonight. It certainly wasn't the ceremony that they'd planned 12 months ago. It's been scaled back. It's more sober, more modest, and quite rightly so, really. I think they hit the tone perfectly right at the beginning when there was that lone athlete on a treadmill for a very, very long time, and then he was joined by dancers who were entangled in those giant rubber bands to give that feeling of being trapped. So a good start, I think, if I'm being honest. The parade of athletes has been a bit lacklustre, but then what do you expect? There's far fewer of them in there, and of course it didn't diminish the fact that Hannah Mills and Mo Sabihi led out Great Britain today. But they're doing all this in front of an empty stadium, a 68,000 stadium, only 1,000 dignitaries in there, and I think you really appreciate how much you miss the appreciation of a crowd and the roar of a crowd when this is going on.
Yeah, it must be quite bizarre for them to be in there with hardly any spectators. And that's going to continue because it's going to be a very different games than anything we've seen before, isn't it?
That's right, Charlene, and that's the point. It's going to be very different for the athletes, and mainly because of the crowd. It's going to be very difficult for them. I think we've all learnt in the last 12, 18 months that the sport just isn't the same without packed stadia. There are going to be other reasons why it's a different experience for all the athletes as well. They're not really allowed to mix with each other as they would do normally, and they have this COVID cloud hanging over their head. They're tested every day, and they're all fearful that they'll get that call from the tester saying, you're positive. That means their dream is over, and they're all really, really nervous about that.
Oh, fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But Steve, thank you so much for talking to us. Supermarket supply chain workers can now use daily COVID tests to escape isolation rules and help keep stores stocked. Key staff working in food distribution will be able to skip self-isolation if they're pinged and go to work as long as they test negative daily for COVID. But there's anger over the scheme for a further 15 key industries. Bosses there will have to prove they need an exemption and then apply for individual staff to escape the rules. Our political correspondent Libby Vina reports.
Relief for the supermarkets after the government's late-night announcement that workers in their distribution centres won't have to self-isolate as long as they test negative for COVID. But there's anger over how limited the scheme is, even for the food sector. It doesn't apparently cover distribution to hospitals.
It's jaw-dropping that the public sector hasn't been included. You've got supply of food and drink to hospitals, to care homes, to prisons, to the military. They're not allowed to apply for this scheme. They're not in scope with this scheme. It's a stitch-up between the government and the supermarkets, acting rapidly, trying to find a solution to a problem that they've created.
Workers in food distribution and some food production get a blanket exemption. Instead, they'll take daily lateral flow tests. In 15 other sectors, including energy, water and transport, companies must show there's a serious risk of disruption. Only a few key named workers will be eligible to skip self-isolation, and every worker must be approved by the government. Staff shortages due to people being pinged mean some train companies are having to cancel services, but they only qualify for the more limited scheme now on offer. How do you run a train service with just a few key roles protected?
Well, you have to differentiate between potentially having a lack of train drivers, in which case not every train runs on time and some trains are cancelled, and that's a consequence of staff absence. And
you're happy to see that?
You have to, we're saying that we recognise that that's a reality during these next few weeks.
But the CBI says testing should replace self-isolation in every industry immediately.
I think we need to bring forward to right now the idea that if you are pinged by the app, that as long as you test negative, you can get back to work. And that's especially true, of course, for vaccinated people and double vaccinated people. And if you're not double vaccinated, well, then let's have a test and release scheme to make sure you can get back to work when it's safe to do so.
But ministers fear that with COVID admissions to hospitals still rising, it's too early to risk that next step. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.
The number of people with COVID-19 across the UK has risen again this week. Our correspondent Juliet has been looking into the data, which has just been released. Juliet Bremer, there are more worrying signs that cases are increasing, especially ahead of this weekend as the first weekend since restrictions were lifted.
Yes, we're seeing from the ONS, that's the Office of National Statistics, that across all regions in the UK, they are going up. But it's before we've taken into account any impact from those relaxations that were last week. And I'll just run you through some of them. England, 1 in 75 people, it's now thought, have the virus, compared with 1 in 95 the week before. Scotland, 1 in 80, compared with 1 in 90 the week before. Wales, 1 in 210, compared with 1 in 360. Northern Ireland, 1 in 170, compared with 1 in 290. So all up, but if we focus on the detail, there's perhaps a glimmer of hope. In the northeast and northwest, they've still got the highest infection rates, but it looks as if they're not increasing as quickly as they were. So possibly a plateauing, although most of the experts say it's too early to say that. We've also just had Public Health England telling us about how many people are going to hospital. We see again that just over half are unvaccinated that end up in hospital. So that proves vaccinations are working. But we know at the same time that young people are not proving as keen to have their vaccinations as the older generations. Of course, they are the ones who are going to the nightclubs. They're the ones who are enjoying these freedoms that they've been given just in the last few days, normally without masks and no social distancing. And we talked to scientists who said that it's still important everyone has the vaccine, but they don't really know what more they can do to try and persuade younger people if they're unwilling.
It's going to cause problems for you. You want to go abroad, you want to do various things, perhaps even go to a nightclub, according to the most recent things said by the government, etc. It's pretty obvious that getting a vaccine is good for you socially and good for you medically. So I'm not entirely sure how much more we can do to convince the youngsters that they should have the vaccine.
And we know the Prime Minister told younger people that unless they were double jabbed at the end of September, they can't go to nightclubs anymore. You see that perhaps as a bribe or a threat. It depends which angle you're coming from. Whatever we are doing, we have not yet persuaded a lot of young people to get vaccinated.
OK, Juliet, thank you. Well, with those COVID cases steadily on the rise again, health officials reminding us to keep practising social distancing to help slow the spread and protect our friends and family.
These things aren't new. We've been doing them for over a year, and it just makes sense to carry on. Let's do what we can to keep this virus under control, because it takes all...
Well, the new campaign to keep life moving features TV's Dr. Amir Khan and also highlights the importance of remaining cautious, even if you are fully vaccinated. And here he is. He joins us now from Leeds. Thanks so much for talking to us, Dr. Khan. I guess the worry is that people may well just take their foot off the brake because essentially all these restrictions have been lifted.
Yes, that's absolutely right. You know, the legal restrictions were lifted on Monday, but it's still really important that people carry on these healthy behaviours because, as we just heard there, COVID cases are on the rise and hospital admissions are on the rise as well. And even those people who've been doubly vaccinated, yes, it significantly reduces your risk of ending up in hospital with severe disease, but you can still get the virus, you can still pass it on to other people. So we want to remind everyone to wash their hands regularly, wear a face covering, get rapid lateral flow tests if you haven't got symptoms, a PCR test if you have got symptoms, ventilate indoor spaces, really, really important. If you're meeting people, I mean, the weather's gorgeous, meet people outside, it's the safest place to be. But if you can't, then inside, open windows, and most importantly of all, get fully vaccinated.
Well, I want to go back to a point that you made about the double vaccinated. I guess people will find it quite difficult to get their heads around the fact that even if they are double vaccinated, they still have to have a certain level of caution.
Yes, so the important thing to remember is the vaccines don't make you immune to the virus. They significantly, and it is a real good protection, significantly reduce your risk of developing severe. Both vaccines still get the virus, and even though they probably would have ended up sicker, they've got mild symptoms. And the virus the vaccine does reduce your risk of transmitting the virus a little bit, but not completely as well. So all those things are important for everyone until enough people are vaccinated.
So many of us have been still singing happy birthday when we wash our hands to make sure we wash them for long enough. But we do know that the virus is primarily airborne. So despite the fact we should all be hygienic anyway, is there a need to still be quite obsessive about using hand sanitizer and washing our hands well?
Well, all of these things work together. If we want the good level of protection against the virus, we've got to be doing all of these things. You know, some things are more important than others, but together they work really, really well. So washing your hands is still important. You're right that, the primary way the virus is spread is airborne. So that goes back to that ventilation of indoor spaces. But all of it together, if we're doing all of them, we're reducing the risk of transmission of this virus, protecting ourselves and other people.
Well, Dr. Amir Khan, in your beautiful garden in Leeds, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The weekend marks the first major festival since the start of the pandemic. 40,000 people have begun to arrive at Latitude for what organisers have called the safest place in England. Festival goers have to prove they've been vaccinated twice or tested negative. ITV reporter Tanya Mercer is there.
There is a sense of normality returning here at Latitude. The festival is part of the latest phase in the government's events research programme, and it is operating at full capacity, meaning that over the next 3 days there will be around 40,000 people descending on Henham Park. Now, festival goers have to either have had a negative lateral flow test in the last 72 hours or be double vaccinated to attend. But despite all the good vibes here, COVID is still very much on the agenda. They've had on one of the stages members of the Digital, Cultural, Media and Sports Committee discussing the impact on the UK's live events programme, and there have been 2 acts already that have had to withdraw because they are self-isolating. However, there are still the headliners, Wolf Alice, the Chemical Brothers and comedians like Bill Bailey and Joe Brand, who will be entertaining the crowds this weekend. And everyone here is hoping it will be a weekend to remember for all the right reasons.
Tanya Mercer there. OK, still to come. The mural that moved a nation. Find out why the messages to Marcus Rashford are being taken away. Now, ahead of the climate change conference, which is called COP26, which is happening in Glasgow later this year, the government is urging us to do all we can to reduce our greenhouse emissions. So using less energy and recycling more. And to do that, they've launched Net Zero Week. Now, net zero is a term we hear bandied around quite a lot, but it essentially means achieving a balance between the carbon emitted into the atmosphere and the carbon removed from it. Fronting the new campaign, surprisingly, is former England rugby player Martin Offiah, best known as one of the top try scorers in history, which earned him a statue outside Wembley Stadium. But now he's dedicating his life to saving the planet. So I'm so pleased to say that Martin joins us now. Thanks so much for talking to us about this lunchtime. So where did the passion for this? Where did this passion for this come from, Martin?
It just came from a lift I had in an EV back in 2016. Andy Gomersall, a fellow rugby player and part of England's 2003 World Cup winning squad, gave me a lift in an i3 at the Cheltenham Festival, and it just sparked my curiosity. So I bought one, I became passionate about them, I learned about them, I just became curious about the whole sort of sustainability sector. And then a good friend of mine, a guy called Richard Clemens, was one of the founders of a company called Connected Curb, who are an electric vehicle charging infrastructure company, the greenest electric vehicle charging infrastructure company in the world, I might add. And yes, I was a brand ambassador for them. Net Zero reached out to me and said, will I come on board and try and communicate the essence of change? Because we hear a lot about what people are actually doing and what the government is doing with their 10-point green industrial revolution plan and the ICE car ban in 2030. But really, at the end of it, it's about us changing our beliefs, because it's hard for people to get on board with net zero if they don't actually believe climate change is an issue. They don't have, the same values that some of us who are passionate about sustainability have.
It's quite hard, isn't it? It's quite hard sometimes to get people to connect with the fact that I guess we are all responsible for what we do individually in order to have that impact. Now, 8 out of 10 Brits, they are already doing something or planning to do something about their emissions over the next 5 years. So what advice can you give? What sort of little changes that we can do that could have a big impact?
The first one is just to, change your mindset. Just have a growth mindset. Let's not look for problems. Let's look for solutions. And if you want ideas, go to netzeroweek.com. There's lots of information on there about what the government is doing, what about corporations are doing, and what you can do as an individual. Be that just change your tariff from probably the most economical one to a green tariff. When these tariffs first came out, I was of the mindset, why would I want this one? I just want the cheapest one. But we have to put sustainability as the number one priority ahead of, whether it makes sense in terms of pounds, shillings and pence. I believe that we should leave this planet in a better place than where we found it. I think about my children, I think about my children's children, my great-grandchildren. Hopefully they'll go and look at my statue at Wembley and say, not only did my great-grandfather was he a good rugby player, he also helped to, have this clean air, which we're enjoying through lockdown.
I tell you what, Martin, you are having an impact in so many different ways, and I appreciate you talking to us this afternoon. Thank you.
My pleasure.
A judge looking into the Omar bombing has recommended the UK and Irish governments carry out an investigation. That's after plausible arguments were found to suggest there was a real prospect the atrocity could have been prevented. 29 people died in what was the worst single atrocity of the Northern Ireland conflict. 6 people have been taken to hospital after a car crashed into a pub in Pontyclun in South Wales last night. The driver, a 79-year-old man, is thought to have suffered a medical episode and is also in a critical condition in hospital. Finally, the Marcus Rashford mural became a national symbol of the country's rejection of racism. The artwork was defaced in the aftermath of the Euros final, but the graffiti was covered up by messages of love and support to Rashford and the players who received abuse. Today, those messages were moved under plans to preserve them forever. Well, Hannah Miller is at the mural in Manchester for us. Hannah, how's this going down with the locals there?
Well, the clean-up operation is well underway. You can see some of the messages have already been packed up in the boxes that are down here. This wall became famous around the world, not really because of the graffiti that was left here, but because of the reaction to it. And there's no doubt that the locals are pretty proud of that. They will also be glad to get this road back open again and for the crowds to go away. Well, we've got over here the last few messages and pictures which are being taken down. They're being packed up, as we say, put into boxes. Some over there are being left to dry out, and they will be sent this afternoon to Manchester Central Library, where they will be held temporarily, although we understand that it will be Marcus Rashford himself who has the final say in where these messages go. One of the organisers told me this morning why it's so important that these are preserved for future generations.
Marcus, and it's about his lived experience. That's the thing that has been at the core of this, and the fact that he has to deal with a huge amount of racism when he's just doing his job and he's really thinking about the community, and everybody's turned up, haven't they, to sort of say they've got his back. So I think it's just simply that makes it important, and that for me is just amazing.
Oh, a lovely message there, and thanks to Hannah. OK, that's it. We're back at 6:30. See you then. Bye.